Hey, folks, it's that time again. It's time for another session of Get to Know Dynatrace. I'm your host, David Jones. Everyone calls me Jonesey. So if you ever run into me, feel free to call me Jonesey. But this Get to Know Dynatrace, it's not about me. It's about Dynatrace and the Dynatrace platform. And what makes these sessions so special is your participation. So wherever you're coming to us from, feel free to type your questions into whatever channel you're watching us on. If it's LinkedIn, Facebook, Reddit, whatever it might be, just chat, type your questions into the chat window and we will do our very best to answer those questions. So, like every edition of Get to Know Dynatrace, I have a couple of upfront segments, and then we're going to hand it over to our guest solution engineer who's going to walk us through a demonstration of Dynatrace. So, let's get things started. I'm going to flip my screen now, and hopefully, we've got a great big blue screen here that says Getting to Know Dynatrace. Hey, why is this still in the right top corner? That's an inside joke. So, anyways, I'm going to move forward with the first segment of Get to Know Dynatrace, which is what's new. So, if you're always trying to find out what's new here at Dynatrace, and there's always so many new things that are going on here at Dynatrace, let me tell you, Dynatrace, if you're not familiar with us, we are an organization that has been focused on innovation for so many years. We are constantly updating our blog site, our news site with new information. Not just that, our platform as well. Every 2 weeks, there is a new version that is pushed out into our platform on our SaaS platform once a month for our managed or on-premise platform. But if you're trying to find out what's new at Dynatrace, you simply go to www.dynatrace.com/news/blog. And there it all is. And these articles can be anything from industry-specific information to information about our platform. There is all sorts of great content that I highly recommend that you take some time and give this a read. And it could be anything from understanding how Dynatrace data can, provide insights by using our new dashboarding and our new notebooking functionality. The notebooks themselves are just a fascinating way of being able to explore the data, be able to ask questions through the Dynatrace platform of your data, and be able to experiment. So you can actually use different Davis analyzers to predict how particular data might trend. It's just it's such an interesting capability. In addition to this, there's all sorts of things that we provide. Like I said before, you could be talking about industry-specific information, like how we analyze open telemetry traces and logs at scale. There's even information about, like, for example, because Dynatrace is such a popular platform, we get nominated for awards all the time. And here you can see that Dynatrace was named Cloud Security Platform of the Year in 2024 for these Cybersecurity Breakthrough Awards. And the Dynatrace platform is not just about observability, but it's observability in context. And also, it takes into account application security. And there's so many capabilities that we have, from threat detection to attack blocking to forensic investigation. These are all parts of the Dynatrace platform. And you're going to be hearing more things about what we're going to be doing in terms of adding new capabilities when it comes to, for example, compliance as well, and doing compliance analysis. This is all things that we have in the works here with our platform. Look forward to that coming out in the future. So if you're trying to find out what's new at Dynatrace, always go to dynatrace.com/news/blog. So much great information there. We also want to make sure that you're aware of Dynatrace Perform. Dynatrace Perform is our industry conference. We do the Dynatrace Perform every year, and we typically do it in Las Vegas, and we're hosting it at the Aria Hotel like we did last year. It was a fabulous event. I can't recommend enough to attend Dynatrace Perform. You can come and join in on our hot day, our hands-on training days so you can actually sit down, work with a whole bunch of Dynatrace experts in terms of learning different concepts in Dynatrace. That could be anything to learning our DQL language, to being able to build workflows, to better automate things. The hands-on training days are immensely popular. These sessions fill up so fast, so make sure you get your name in early for that. We only have so much space for the hands-on training, so it's a first come, first serve. Now, in terms of actual attendance, the conference itself is always well attended. We have a great agenda for you this year. You want to make sure that when you attend, that you get a chance to interact with your peers and other people in the industry. One of the things that I love most about Perform is the stories, being able to go to Perform and understand how people are leveraging the Dynatrace platform and using it in ways that we hadn't even considered. So the Dynatrace Perform conference, like I said, it's a great experience in a great venue, and it's happening this year in Las Vegas, February 3rd to 5th. So if you can attend in person, by all means do that. If you can't attend in person, there will be a virtual conference that's happening at the same time. So if you can't attend in person, make sure you get signed up and at least attend virtually. So the next segment of Get to Know Dynatrace is Did You Know? What I like to do here is I like to take some time and actually walk through an example of something that you may not been aware of that is related to the Dynatrace platform. And so this week's Did You Know? Did you know that Dynatrace integrates with serverless functions across your various cloud platforms? Serverless capabilities are a hallmark of cloud compute. The whole concept of either it being, AWS Lambda functions or Azure functions or Google Cloud functions, these are all mechanisms that allow you to basically, without having to stand up a VM or your own servers, these are functions that allow you to create applications that can run in a completely serverless fashion. Now, in the past, this has provided potentially a challenge when it comes to observability, because if you don't own the server, how do you instrument it? Well, there are mechanisms that you can use to absolutely instrument your serverless functions. And so whether or not you're using that AWS, the Azure, or the Google Cloud functions, you can use the Dynatrace platform to help you instrument those serverless functions. And what that allows us to do is that allows us to basically go in and create those traces, ingest those logs, be able to see those metrics, all of that classic observability type of information that we provide, but then have it analyzed by that Davis AI so that if there is a problem, if there is an issue, that Davis AI can tell you that that issue exists and then point to that root cause for that issue. And even if you're using something like OpenTelemetry and you're instrumenting your serverless function using something like OpenTelemetry, we can consume that OpenTelemetry, and all of those OpenTelemetry spans and traces can be ingested by the Dynatrace platform. And again, that AI can be used to analyze the performance of those applications. But now you can also use things like our workflows to be able to automate responses and help drive perhaps self-healing routines within those applications. So what that allows you to do is, set up applications and you can use Dynatrace to shift left in terms of finding problems sooner, faster, using Dynatrace and our things like our site reliability guardians to be able to, detect an issue before it makes its way into production. But you can also use it to shift right and help automate and self-heal when it detects a condition, to automatically run a workflow to change perhaps some parameters to see if it will actually fix an issue. So these are all different things that the Dynatrace platform enables you to do. So that's this week's Did You Know? Did you know that Dynatrace integrates with serverless functions across your various cloud platforms? All right, folks, without any more ado, we're getting to the best part of Get to Know Dynatrace. and that is demo time. So this is honestly, this is the best part of Get to Know Dynatrace, demo time. And this week's guest solution engineer is Vlad Yudin. Vlad is coming to us from the Great White North. Hey, Vlad, how you doing?
Hey, Jonesey. Hey, everybody. I'm doing great. How are you guys?
All right. Okay. So Vlad's going to get set up, and he's going to walk us through a demonstration of Dynatrace. And folks, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the session, what makes these Get to Know Dynatrace sessions so useful, so fun, are your questions. So as we're going through the demo, feel free to fire out questions to us. We'll do our very best to answer those questions. If we can't, we'll try to find out what those answers are, and then we'll we'll hit you back afterwards. But with that, Vlad, it's it's your show. Over to you. Walk us through some stuff about Dynatrace.
Absolutely. Yeah. Happy to walk you guys through some of the new features of Dynatrace today. So I hope you can see the screen okay. And today, really, I wanted to kind of continue the conversation around some of the latest and greatest functionality. So, Jonesy, you kind of talked a little bit about, some of the newer features. So I thought, maybe we could kind of dive in deeper and see really how we enhanced some of those classic views that we were used to seeing, right? So for those of you that aren't aware, so Dynatrace is a end-to-end observability platform. And the way it works is we actually install a component called the One Agent on your hosts and your infrastructure. And what it's going to do is it's going to monitor kind of the main performance metrics, the traces and the logs around the hosts, the underlying processes, and actually dig into the code level and instrument the underlying services. So what I'm going to show today here is what we call the infrastructure and operations app. So we've kind of enhanced that host classic view that we were used to seeing. And we have a view that kind of shows more around a comprehensive view of what's actually happening on the hosts themselves. So you can see the One Agent picks up the major technologies of those hosts, of the technologies that are running underneath. But really what we're also able to see just at a glance is the health of some of those hosts, right? So we can see where there's problems. We can see where there's bottlenecks at the host level, at the data center level as well. So we kind of capture all the major data centers, and we can really filter down and see which data centers are having problems, which hosts kind of are outlined with some of those problems right away. And we get a snapshot of what's actually running on that host and the main performance metrics. So again, this is going to be enabled by the One Agent, where we're going to be able to see those metrics like CPU, memory usage, disk space. But then beyond that, we can actually see into the actual underlying problems on that host. So we're going to be able to see any active resource level issues, service level problems. And what we can actually do is we can click in and see all of the affected components of that particular issue. So this is kind of a simpler problem, just showing a CPU saturation issue. So we'll go in more in depth into the actual application level issue, how we can dive into the code level details. But really, we revamped this view quite a bit to be able to show you sort of the main, again, the main metrics, the properties that are running, all in one sort of easy to see view.
Right, it's actually, Vlad, before you go on, there's a couple of things that I find really interesting, because for those folks that are familiar with Dynatrace, if you have used it in the past, typically when you were going through from one screen to another, specifically in this host view, what would happen is I would click on a host and then I would go to a completely different screen, a completely new screen. And what's really interesting about this is that now what happens is I click on a host and we get a slide out that basically shows us what's going on for that particular host. So now I'm not losing the context of where I've been. This is just a much easier mechanism. Mark Tomlinson. Love you, Mark Tomlinson. Absolutely. Telling us this is the way. Absolutely. This is just something that we spend a lot of time. We listen to the feedback that we get from all of the customers that use Dynatrace. And this was some of the feedback that was provided to us in terms of, hey, you know what? When I'm navigating through Dynatrace, sometimes I lose context of where I am and what I'm looking at. And now features like this make it just much easier for someone to be able to just look at something, see the detail that they need to. If they want to drill down, they have the ability to do that. But I'm always in that context, so I can always see what's going on that left-hand side of the screen. So this is something that's new. Is there something on the host page which shows what services are on the processes of those hosts? So here you can see the processes, and you can drill down into those processes. Now, that's an excellent question. And let's see if we've got that over there on the left-hand side. Is that, nope, we're still looking at the process view there. So this is that's some excellent feedback. And that's something that definitely should be considered. So, this is part of the reason why Get to Know Dynatrace is such a great forum for this kind of stuff. You know what? We're going to write some notes down. You're right. That would be actually a really handy thing to have happen there. So that's really useful feedback. I appreciate that. Sorry. Hey, listen, Vlad, I completely just trounced your demo. I just jumped right in there because I was looking at some of the comments about this. So anyways, listen, back to you. Why don't you keep us going here?
Absolutely. No, Jonesy, that was a great point about how basically we're adding in views that make it much more intuitive to start using some of these apps. And as we'll start to see, so one of the things is that we're actually including a lot of this functionality into separate apps. So the infrastructure and operations app is going to target mostly the host and processes. So that might be one of the reasons why those services aren't directly on a page like this. But what we'll see, I'll bring up a kind of a troubleshooting scenario here, and we can actually see how we can drill into service level problems from the host page, right? So that same way we're used to getting kind of that full stack visibility from the host page all the way down to the underlying services, we can do that same thing from the apps. And we'll see that the apps are actually interconnected in a way where it's intuitive to use them. So, you get an overview of your infrastructure, all your related processes from this page, right? So we were looking at an overview. We get all of the major problems associated with this particular host. As you mentioned, Jonesy, we can also see vulnerabilities now. So if there's any vulnerable libraries or anything in the code that's actually has any functions that are vulnerable, those will actually get highlighted and listed in this vulnerabilities perspective. So that's really neat as well. And it's something that the One Agent actually does out of the box. So one of the things we could do if we identify that, let's say there's problems on one of these hosts, we can actually click into one of the problems and see the associated impact, right? So again, we're still on this infra and operations app, but we can kind of see the major problems and the associated events. So one of the things that we can actually do is we can jump right from this app all the way to now we're looking at the problems app. And so again, we're looking at this multiple application problems kind of problem card here. But if I just exit out of this very quickly, you'll see all the problems in the environment, right? So we just went from one app, the infra and operations, to another one that's connected very seamlessly, where we can kind of get a perspective now into more of those problem details. So what's working in the background here is actually our Davis AI engine. So we have an AI engine that correlates all the context together. And so it understands, full stack in terms of what's actually running underneath the host, the major applications and technologies, et cetera, that are actually being picked up. But then it's also going to see end to end. So it's also going to understand, from the web application side or from the actual front end, any slowdowns, any errors that are actually happening from that side, and how it actually passes through the various tiers like backend services, middleware services, a database, and all of those relevant problem events are going to get included in the same problem card. So one of the things I hear from clients frequently is that with their more traditional monitoring tools, each one of these error events or these problem events would trigger a separate alert. So they would have to then, check their emails. They have to see which ones are meaningful or which ones are noisy. And so that's a lot of manual correlation. Whereas with the causal AI aspect of our AI engine, what it does is it actually includes all these problems into one problem card. And then beyond that, it can tell you, hey, this easy travel service, there's actually a failure on it that was the root cause, which caused all of this impact, right? And we can even tell you how many users it affected on the front end, how many downstream services were impacted, and kind of give you a bigger picture of what's happening.
So, so Vlad, it's looking like, by the way I read this about 25 different alerts would have been triggered off of this problem. Like, so
Yes.
you could imagine that in a data center, in an ops center, I should say, when, your operations team all of a sudden gets 25 inbound emails from disparate systems, how do they, how would somebody sit there and be able to, correlate to understand what's related to what? Like, how do you weed out the red herrings? How do you actually find that root cause? That sounds really hard if you're not using something like Dynatrace.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And to add to that, you're also looking at, frequently there's customers that'll use multiple monitoring tools, right? So they'll have a tool suite where they're looking at their infrastructure data. There might be a separate tool they're looking to look at code level insights or the digital experience. And so you kind of have to look at all of these tools in isolation and piece together what the cause of the issue is. So I actually remember I when I was a consultant working at a financial institution, I remember there was an issue with one of the there's basically a button you could press to get support from an agent or like chat help. And that button would stall for about 10 to 15 seconds. And so, from a technical perspective, Jonesy, you and I might look at that and say, okay, well, what's going on there? Is that a network latency issue?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a microservice that's failing? Is there, a slow database? So without that context that Dynatrace gives you out of the box, it's very hard to kind of piecemeal things together and be able to actually correlate what the root cause is, right? Whereas here we have the AI engine tell us, hey, this was the root cause, right? There's a failure, and that actually led to those issues on that front end.
And if like I'm old school, so back in the day, what we would do is we would get somebody to start sifting through log files and start looking for that needle in the haystack. But now, if I know where all this problem information is, it's all right here. What if I wanted to understand the logs that are associated with this?
Perfect. Yeah, great question. So one of the aspects of Dynatrace, again, the keyword of the day I would say is context, right? The fact that we're able to retain context across the platform, and that also ties into the way we look at logs. So we saw on the host level, the process level, we could see the associated logs with that. But further, I can actually go into the problem card and see all of the error logs that were associated with this particular problem. So just by clicking the log section, now I can see all of the error logs that are associated with this specific problem. So again, we think about all of that manual work it takes to, filter timestamps or filter error codes. And then you have to, get the technical teams on the call to actually figure out what's happening on the back end, right? So here we could just immediately see, hey, here's our logs, here's the content. And then we also see that context that I was talking about. We see all of the underlying topology for that log. So we see the host that it's running under. If it's in a Kubernetes environment, we could see the namespace. We could even see, the application group or the team that's responsible for this particular service or these logs. And as I'll show you in just a second, we can actually correlate this to the traces. But long story short, we can really, really expedite the troubleshooting process because these logs are linked to the services by default and the problems by default.
So, it's funny when we go back to that analogy that I was using about, having your best and brightest sifting through, looking for a needle in a haystack. It feels like this Davis AI engine, now that it provides all of the contextual logs just by pushing a button. It's like me taking the haystack and me rolling up a giant super magnet that's just going to like suck that needle out of that haystack so I can immediately find it.
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. So one of the next things I kind of wanted to show was how we can actually link this to code level visibility. So I talked about how the agent, we can pick up the performance metrics on, the logs, the traces on the host and the process level, but we can actually also dive right into the code level. So this is something the one agent does automatically, is the instrumentation of the code level where we could see where these exceptions are actually taking place. So the really cool part about all this is that if there's a trace ID associated with these logs, we can actually open this with a distributed tracing app. And so kind of like what I was saying before, where we have these seamless integration with other apps, you can see there's a variety of apps that I can use to explore these logs further.
Yeah, so
So
hold on. So this is for folks who have used Dynatrace, this is probably a new view. This is probably a new concept to them. And if you're new to Dynatrace, this is just an immensely powerful mechanism that I'm looking at a log line. Vlad is showing us a log line, and he's basically now said, open this with. And now you have a whole slew of capabilities. If I want to understand the context of where this log line came from in terms of the entity that generated it in its relationship to others, I could go into the Smartscape view. If I want to see this in relation to the service that this is associated with, I can go into the service view. So Vlad, keep going, bud. This is just amazing stuff.
Yeah, awesome. Perfect. Yeah, so one of the things, like I mentioned, we could do, so we have a trace ID, and we can immediately go right from the log perspective into a distributed trace. So you'll see here, we're going to go into our new distributed tracing app. So we'll see, sort of those end-to-end transactions that some of us might be familiar with. And we'll see now we're filtered on that specific trace view, right? So directly from the logs, we can now see the code level visibility, right? So in traditional kind of troubleshooting scenarios or war rooms, where you would have had to get multiple people on the call, the development team, the ops team, we have a view now where you can actually see exactly what's happening from those various perspectives, right? We can see the logs, and now we can actually follow those logs to the trace. So we saw earlier that this easy travel service, that was the root cause of the issue, right? So there's a failure on this particular store booking endpoint. You can kind of see this new distributed tracing app in action. So there's some similarities and some changes to the way this used to look before. But again, you get that waterfall view of sort of the endpoints and the timing details. And then on the right-hand side, you get all of the information associated with the request itself, right? So the methods that get passed along, the attributes associated with the request. And then most importantly, we get the exception details here, right? So in just a few clicks, right from the logs, we can now see all of the exception details associated with how this method was executed. So right here, we're able to see down to the line of code, right? What would have taken a development team, looking at their code, checking their releases, again, trying to manually stitch together those logs to failures they're seeing at the code level. We can now pinpoint the exact lines of code where this failure happened with the distributed tracing app.
It's funny, Vlad, because if you go back, the way that a lot of organizations would try to find this is they try to reproduce the error, right?
Right.
And inevitably what happens is when you try to reproduce the error, you're not necessarily doing it on the production system that it came from. And so there's all sorts of potential dependencies and details that could get missed and give you a wrong indication. Now there's a bunch of questions that just sort of like have been trickling in. So let's just
Perfect.
take a pause for a moment and answer some of these. So first question is DPS a prerequisite? So
Yeah.
go ahead, Vlad.
Sure. Yeah. So DPS is the sort of the new licensing model. So I would say a lot of the features and functionality we're introducing, as we'll explore the foundation and discovery mode, some of these new features are running on DPS. So I would say moving forward, it's definitely a good idea to move to that licensing model, whereas you could still use classic licensing for your full stack monitoring, but generally the newer features are going to be built off DPS.
Yep, absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. Okay, so what have we got here? How often do new apps get released and updated in Dynatrace? So if you've been following the new platform, you can see now that the number of apps that are available has definitely increased. We're constantly adding. I can't give you a specific number in terms of the apps that are, how many are being released and how often they're being released. I can tell you that our team in Linz, Austria, that does our development, they're working hard on creating all sorts of new apps and new capabilities. So there's going to be a constant stream of these new apps that are going to be always added to the platform, and that's one of the reasons why you want to keep up to date in terms of every so often have a look at our release notes. In terms of what we've added. There's always going to be little product indicators, that are going to say, hey, there's new capabilities, and there'll be little flags on many of these apps to say that they're new. So these are things that you're going to want to keep, sort of keep abreast of. But definitely there is going to be a whole bunch more of these apps that are going to be made available over time. All right. What else do we got? How does Dynatrace connect? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Vlad.
Sorry, I didn't know there was another question. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, did you want to add something to that last one?
Actually, there was one thing I wanted to add. So totally agree with your point around, these releases being quite frequent, right? So sometimes you go into an app and you'll see, some of the format's been tweaked or there's new features added, but I would really guide you to the Dynatrace Hub to kind of see what's possible. So this is a really good kind of a page to see what's supported out of the box and also some of the extended functionality we can include. So I always think this is a great starting point because, you can see kind of the power of the one agent, the 600 plus technologies that are supported, but then also the integrations and the available extensions that we have for added technologies. So
that's a fabulous point, Vlad. And even if you go and click into one of these items, they would have versioning for them and version information about what's changed within them as well. So that's a really good point. So thanks for bringing that up. Absolutely. All right, we had one other question that was popped up there. Maybe we could get back to that one. How does Dynatrace connect to incoming traces from other clients and external traffic? So, Vlad, do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things actually, Jonesy, so this is really neat, is if you open the distributed tracing app, just the kind of the homepage, you'll see that you can add traces from a variety of sources, right? So this is relatively new. You get sort of just the host base. This is kind of the one agent kind of way of adding traces natively into the platform. But then there's also options to add traces and spans from other technologies, right? So OpenTelemetry is a very popular one where we can actually ingest those traces into Dynatrace. But I find this homepage does a really good job of describing some of the various traces that we can import and even guides you in the setup, which is really neat.
That's fabulous. There you go. So thank you for that question. It's a great question. So, if you want to figure out how to get the traces into Dynatrace, there you go. How big is the Grail data lakehouse? That's an interesting question. So the Grail data lakehouse in terms of size is highly dependent upon the amount of data that you're storing in it. So it could, for some customers and some users, it could conceivably be, relatively small. For other users that have massive data needs, data ingest needs, where they're ingesting, say, terabytes of logs per day and terabytes of traces per day, it could be much, 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 much larger. I can tell you that, where we're headed is we want to get to a point where the Grail data lakehouse is we're at a point where we're ingesting, petabytes of data per day. And that is something that is a little bit further out, but definitely that's where we're headed. And so right now we're into a range of, very comfortably, hundreds of terabytes are things that we can support now. And what you can expect from us in the future is getting into that sort of petabyte range.
Awesome.
All right. Oh, so do we have a third-party tool that implements a different header for its traces? Is there a way that Dynatrace can utilize those? That's a great question. So things like, for example, an XRay header. So there are mechanisms that are part of, I would say this, that there are mechanisms that could potentially be used. We have effectively an SDK that the SDK itself could potentially be used to actually take a header from another technology and potentially be used. I would say that it would require some effort to do that. It's a really good question. Vlad, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say certainly it's on the roadmap as far as ingesting AWS metadata, like additional topology into the service views of the AWS services. And I believe XRay traces are also something that Grail is going to support, kind of coming up on the roadmap. So that's something that I've heard.
That was the one that sort of like came to mind first, is because it comes up often as, people that are using things like XRay. For the most part, where the industry is really sort of headed is around things using W3C trace context. W3C trace context tends to be where everyone, is moving. OpenTelemetry is based upon W3C trace context. We ourselves here at Dynatrace are, one of the, we actually, members of our staff are actually writing that specification at the W3C. So this is something that is certainly in our minds all the time. But W3C trace context tends to be what people focus on. Are there any resources that show you how you might attempt something like that? For example, Google uses cloud trace headers. We would love to implement. Well, I tell you what, I will take some time right now to actually go do a little searching, and Vlad's going to continue on with the demo. So if you don't mind, let's put a little pin in that question. We'll see if we can get back to it with an answer before the end of today's show. So Vlad, why don't you continue on in the demo? And these are great questions, by the way, folks. Thank you for them.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, so kind of to touch on what I was talking about earlier with the new tracing app. So again, we're able to see fundamentally that exception, right? Lots of details around the request itself, but we can actually dive right in and see where the exception was, where in the code level it happened. You'll see that the waterfall view, again, if I expand some of these other services that the request passes through, we'll get kind of that full waterfall view that we're used to seeing in the classic view. It's just organized a little bit differently, where we could see more of the timing details on the left-hand side and then the metadata on the right. Now, one really neat thing I wanted to show about this app is this new component called facets. So if I just kind of expand out just to all the distributed traces in the environment, you'll see all the traces, the various services and endpoints that get detected. We actually have this filter available now called facets, where you can use, again, any metadata at the service level. We can actually use to then filter down a lot of this information, right? So we can use request attributes, like a specific destination, or let's say a credit card type that was used in a transaction. So you can actually use some of those attributes and filter down the data that we want to see, right? So that way, that's going to really, we can use a lot of these properties to basically update and see those various traces. The one that I think is really interesting is actually these exception classes. So Jonesey or anybody in the audience, if you guys remember, we had basically a part of the platform called multi-dimensional analysis.
Yes, we did.
Yep. And basically, you kind of had to filter, you got, let's say, your requests or your services based on exception class, but you kind of have to jump a lot from menu to menu to be able to understand, your different exceptions. And then once you charted them out, you have to go to a separate view to look at your traces. So the idea here is that we have everything in one spot, right? So if you're looking at those end-to-end transactions, we can click something like this and we can immediately click into that exception class and understand how many traces have that exception. Again, dive right into that trace level and be able to actually see all the, again, the trace level details. And what's really nice is that beyond just that, we can also see and add any DQL fields that are associated with that service. We can actually use as a facet or a filter to be able to filter down those distributed traces further. So we have much more granularity now as far as, filtering and how we can actually filter down this data versus what we had in the past. So that's kind of a high-level overview of the tracing app. What I want to move into now, if there's no other questions or anything else we wanted to talk about, I wanted to basically touch on the automation piece, right? So lots of times from customers, I hear, okay, so we have these problems. We get all these problems that Davis is detecting. What do we actually do with them? Like, how can we actually automate them or, create remediation patterns around them? So that's really where the workflows come in. And workflows are basically a series of triggers and automations that you can create to basically, send notifications, trigger remediation workflows around any problems, any security vulnerabilities that you might see in the environment. So I'm going to basically walk through a very, bare bones example of how one could be set up, and then we'll look through some existing examples. So one of the things I can actually do here is you'll see here, we can actually select the trigger. So this is what's going to kind of start our workflow. So we can use something like a detected problem, right? So we have the AI engine already detect a variety of different problems. So we can use one of those, whether it's an availability, service level issue. You can choose one or more event categories to actually include in the problem. And then we could start to build this workflow out and add actions and tasks to the automation, right? So now we can do things like execute DQL queries, right? You'll see a lot of the actions here are actually built in by the technology type, right? So we even have integrations with AWS functions, right? Let's say we have a CPU increase or a resource issue, and we need to add an EC2 instance to a scaling group, right? We might need to load balance them out. So we can use that problem as a trigger and then add an auto scaling action to add that host into the scaling group, right? So that way we can immediately kind of create an action to do that. And then we can also get, within Dynatrace, we can get ownership information. So as I scroll down here, you'll see a variety of options we have to add tasks. Again, you can make integrations with email. You can add comments to Jira tickets. And one of the things you can actually do is get ownership info directly within Dynatrace, right? So from the problem, we'll get some metadata. We'll get the entities that were involved with the problem, and we can actually assign ownership to understand who's actually responsible for dealing with these problems, right? So if it's something like an infrastructure level issue, we can then highlight the infrastructure team to deal with those issues, right? So that way, once we create this trigger, we can then add additional tasks, right? So now we understand who the owners are. And this is where we can start to integrate with notification channels. So we could send an email. We can, through something like ServiceNow, we can create an incident or send a comment to a specific incident, right? So, we can actually pass CI information down from the problem card into something like ServiceNow and then comment on an existing incident within that platform. Additionally, we might want to do something like send a Slack notification, right? Or send a Teams message. So like I said, a lot of these tasks are available out of the box. And then I could do something like send a message, right? So if there's a channel for that particular infra team, I could choose that specific channel and then actually send out a specific message. So tons of flexibility with how you can actually build out these workflows and, add to that element of proactive monitoring, right? You're not just kind of dealing with these issues manually. You can set up these workflows to really, create these various automations.
Very, very cool, Vlad. It's so interesting. What you've shown us is that when we combine this with the concepts of our site reliability guardians, where we can actually set up, or even things like our Davis analyzers, by setting up the Davis analyzers as well as the site reliability guardians, and then combining these with these workflows, it just allows us to open up a whole new world for automation. And then when you use these workflows in combination with other automation tools, like say an Ansible or Chef or Puppet, that truly opens the doors for creating self-healing applications. So imagine if you will, a situation where Dynatrace detects an issue, and then based upon the rules within a site reliability guardian, it then triggers a workflow. It goes through this workflow and then says, hey, part of this workflow, we actually have to make a change on that server or that box. Let's trigger this external Ansible workflow, and then let's evaluate if making that change, in fact, actually improved things. If it improved things, then automatically close out the ITSM ticket and write a note saying to Jira, hey, humans, by the way, we detected this issue. We ran this remediation script. It fixed the problem. That's a brave new world that we live in, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And the way that you can, intuitively combine, these different tasks, not to mention the custom code that you can create to, query for certain data and then use that within your automation. Like the possibilities are really endless with it.
So here's a question for you, Vlad. So everything that we're showing on the workflows, and we talked about using it in the context of the Davis analyzers and site reliability guardians. I know that with the Dynatrace platform, we can capture things like business events. Can I trigger a workflow based upon information contained within a business event?
Absolutely. Yeah. So if we go back to this problem trigger, we can actually change the trigger type. So that was just an example of using a problem, but we can actually use any event that we detect within Dynatrace. So business events would be one type. We can actually also use, security events. So we can use vulnerabilities. If we detect a high risk vulnerability, we can even use that as a trigger. But to your point, yeah, absolutely. We can use the biz events and actually have those trigger the workflows for us as well.
Okay, so we just had a question pop up. Can we explain the difference between external web service rules and external web request rules? Got to think about this for a second because I'm trying to think of the context. So typically an external web request is going to be just that. It's a web request is going to be an HTTP request that's, going off to some endpoint, right? Whereas a service request could be An external service request could be using perhaps a different protocol. I'm not sure on that one off the top of my head. I think I need to understand the context of that a little bit more. That's an interesting question. What do you think, Vlad?
Yeah, I'm with you. I think perhaps some more context around the use case, because I guess the service naming rule would change how the service shows up within Dynatrace, but then within that service, you get the various endpoints, right? So if I just jump back here for a sec, you get sort of the main services, and then those services will contain the endpoints. So we can change how the actual requests under the services are monitored. But those would be kind of two different things. So again, I'm not sure if I kind of understood that question right, but maybe more context around the question would help.
So before we hold on a second here. If you go to the settings in the service detection page, there's a few different flavors of service detection. Oh, service detection rules.
Gotcha.
Okay, so this is about service detection rules. So so service detection. So first off, this is in the and we have to be really careful sometimes here at Dynatrace when we talk about services. Dynatrace has a concept of services that's just, it's an inherent part of the way that our Dynatrace Davis AI views the world. It's part of our model. So there is a layer that we call services. This is, if you're coming to us and you're new to Dynatrace, you may be aware of the concept of services from, like, say, Kubernetes services. This is something completely different. So I just want to make sure that we understand that this is a internal concept to Dynatrace, not the Kubernetes services. So from the point of view of Dynatrace, you can set up custom rules, like basically out of the box. Dynatrace tries and does, for the most part, a pretty good job of being able to distinguish one service from another. And it could be based upon, the processes that they're running on. It could be based upon all sorts of different criteria. And you can create rules that allow you to basically split what is coming into one service into potentially two services or multiple services if need be. And with those service detection rules, you could use, as an example, you could use if it's a web request, you could use a portion of a URL or a URI. You could use a portion of that to say anything that comes across and it has like slash, slash service, whatever I'm calling it, slash. If I've got part of that URI, I can create essentially a rule to say, if I see any web request that comes in and it's got that content within that URI, I want to treat that as a separate service. You can set up a rule in Dynatrace to do that. But you can also set up different services to be automatically detected or split apart. You can do this, I believe, if I remember correctly, you could probably also do it at the method level as well. But that actually requires you to go in to a method explorer that allows you to basically pick and choose and say, hey, any trace that is, coming across and the method is, hitting this, and that could be, and this could be a specific method, treat that as a separate service. So there's different rules for this kind of stuff. Ultimately, your mileage is going to vary depending upon what you're trying to do in splitting apart those services. It could be a little bit longer conversation than we have time for here today. Let's see, what else do we got? Actually, Vlad, we've got like 5 minutes. Are there any last things that you wanted to see?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I'll just touch very quickly on the workflow stuff. So I mean, you pretty much nailed most of what we can do with the automation, right? Where we can, beyond just sending notifications, we could trigger remediation jobs. And we can also bake in the predictive capabilities, right? So the AI engine now, it's not only just the causal AI, but we actually have capabilities for forecasting metrics into the future, right? So if you have disk sizing issues or capacity issues on a disk, we can actually predict when that disk is going to fill up, and then inform the appropriate stakeholders or comment on Jira issues, and actually leverage that aspect of the AI to within the automations.
All right, so hold on. So what you're saying is that I can now use this Davis analyzer to do like a predictive analysis and create a workflow that's going to automatically potentially resize a disk that's filling up?
Absolutely. Yep.
So again, folks, we live in a brave new world. This is the kind of stuff that if you've ever lived in the operations world, you're probably always getting into situations where a disk is filling up, or maybe a network switch, all of a sudden is getting way too much traffic to it. And so now if we can start detecting those conditions and, basically predict out that, it's going to actually get into a failure state, let's actually run then a workflow to potentially resize it, change the configuration, and head it off before it becomes a problem. That's going to make a lot of people really happy.
Yeah, 100%.
All right. So listen, folks, we are at near the top of the hour. We got a couple of things that we just want to mention before we roll out for today. First off, folks, your questions today have been absolutely fabulous. Okay, these have been great cross section of questions. Z Sparks there. I see you're trying to, I see that question, or the context a little bit more, that you're using the external web request rules to split apart our services that get grouped into the request to public networks, but don't understand the use case of external web service rule. So I'll tell you what, we'll try to follow up with you specifically afterwards to give you some sort of context around that. But thank you very much for asking that question. It was an interesting sort of going in and explaining how it's done. We don't often get a chance to do that on Get to Know Dynatrace. So thank you for that. Folks, a couple of things. First off, Vlad, great demos. Loved it. Loved you showing us all that stuff on the workflows. I like how you showed us, going from the logs to the contextual traces. Just, fabulous job. Thank you so much. Folks, a couple of things. I'm just looking off screen here real quick because I see that KubeCon is coming up. KubeCon 2024 is coming up November 12th to 15th in Salt Lake City. We are going to be there at booth J9. So please, if you're at KubeCon, feel free, drop by. You want to see the new stuff that we're doing on the Kubernetes side. You absolutely want to see that. And then also we've got AWS reInvent is coming up. We're going to be in Vegas. It's going to be December 2nd to 6th. So again, we're going to have a booth there. If you're in Vegas for AWS reInvent, stop by the booth. We'd be happy to meet you. And then finally, the last thing we want to do is just, once again, folks, just remember, we got Dynatrace Perform that's coming up in February. It's rapidly approaching. If you haven't already signed up, if you have the opportunity to come to Perform, in person, you want to do that sooner rather than later. And I think we've got a little exit roll that we're going to do talking about that. And with that, folks, have a great day, and we'll see you next time on the next edition of Get to Know Dynatrace.